So today let's understand hypothalamic hormones and their stimulatory and inhibitory effects on anterior pituitary hormones, right? So I'm gonna divide this whole lesson into eight little chapters. The first chapter is gonna be we're gonna think about the big picture, right? Second thing we're gonna understand about anterior pituitary, right, and its principle, how it works. Third chapter is gonna be gonadal axis, that is GnRH and LHFSH. We'll understand every cell, Leydig, Sertoli, theca, granulosa. Fourth is gonna be thyroid, growth hormone, ACTH. Fifth is gonna be dopamine and prolactin, the pituitary stalk, prolactinoma, dopamine agonist, right? Sixth is gonna be posterior pituitary, that is ADH and oxytocin. Seventh, we're gonna understand all of these chapters together. That's we will integrate all chapters, compare every hormone, feedback loops, right? And then eighth chapter is gonna be just some sort of conclusion that we can come up to. So let's start the first chapter. The first chapter is entire hypothalamus, right? So we'll try to understand the big picture. So the big picture, the entire hypothalamic pituitary system, we're gonna build that whole framework, right? Now before we memorize GnRH, right? GnRH leads to LH or CRH leads to ACTH. We want to answer one thing, that is, why do we have pituitary gland, right? Why doesn't hypothalamus directly control every organ, right? Because if you understand this question, the rest of the endocrine becomes really easier. So we want to imagine the body as a country, right? Think of endocrine system like a government. Brain gives signal to hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is the president, right? And then pituitary works as a prime minister in this government. And then we have these peripheral endocrine glands such as ministers, right? And then eventually we have these target tissues that are the citizens, right? So hypothalamus doesn't have the time to directly supervise every organ. Instead, it delegates, right? That's what it does. Now, why the hypothalamus is the boss? Why hypothalamus is the president here? Well, hypothalamus has this unique ability to receive information from almost everywhere. It monitors body temperature, osmolarity, stress, satiety, circadian rhythm, blood glucose, sex steroid levels, right? Everything. It gets these signals from all over the body. Think of it as a body sensor, central sensor, okay? So whenever you're starving, you're dehydrated, you're frightened, right? Your estrogen level rises, everything is censored, everything is sensed by hypothalamus. Now, why not let hypothalamus secrete everything then, right? Because it's getting the signal from everywhere. Now, let's suppose that hypothalamus has had to produce these cortisol, testosterone, estrogen, growth hormone, prolactin, ADH, oxytocin, insulin, everything. Now, it would become such an enormous task for hypothalamus, and it would become enormously complex. Evolution solved this by creating hierarchy. Instead of making every hormone itself, the hypothalamus mainly issues commands, right? And these commands are called releasing hormones, or I can call it as inhibitory hormones, right? These commands are called releasing hormones. So hypothalamus produces these releasing hormones. Once these releasing hormones are there, you have the pituitary producing the important hormone, the hormone that's supposed to be secreted, right? So we have a three-level axis, okay? Almost every endocrine system has three-level axis. First is hypothalamus. So hypothalamus releases that releasing hormone. This releasing hormone goes to anterior pituitary and then it acts upon it. And then this anterior pituitary produces the tropic hormone. And this tropic hormone goes to the target, peripheral endocrine gland. Then this tropic hormone goes there and then talks to the endocrine gland, and then finally the endocrine gland produces the final hormone, and that hormone goes to the target tissue. And once this whole thing is completed, we have a negative loop, so that we have a you know we have a good balance of hormones, right? Important thing is that the target, after the final hormone touches the target tissue, the negative feedback loop starts, okay? For example, hypothalamus produces CRH, right, and it goes to anterior pituitary. Once it reaches there, the anterior pituitary releases ACTH. Then the ACTH goes to adrenal cortex, and then cortex, at the cortex level, the cortex produces this cortisol, and this cortisol actually goes to the hypothalamus again, and it works in the negative feedback, right? So hypothalamus rarely acts directly, right? It controls another glands, and it controls these glands via some systems, right? Via these commands, right? It controls another gland, which control another gland, right? So we have these multiple steps, right? But we don't have that hypothalamus directly releasing cortisol, right? Because multiple steps provide this thing which is called as amplification, right? So the concept here is that one hypothalamic neuron can stimulate thousands of pituitary cells. Each pituitary cell releases these large amount of hormones, right? And the adrenal gland then produces even larger amount of cortisol, right? So tiny input, huge output. That's the concept about amplification. Let's talk about fine regulation. Suppose cortisol becomes really high. Should the adrenal stop? What do you think? Should the ACTH decrease? Should the CRH decrease? Our body can regulate these multiple checkpoints, right? This is much more stable than one step. Just imagine you have just hypothalamus directly talking to the cortex. Then you'll have problem really fine-tuning the whole system, right? So that's why we have this fine-tuning and we have this amplification, and it's done via multiple step. Okay, let's talk about feedback, the negative feedback. Every endocrine cells, every endocrine axis, right, is essentially a thermostat. Okay, so room gets cold, thermostat turns the heater on, rooms get warm, right? So thermostat turns the heater off as well if the room is very hot, right? So hormones work exactly the same way. Low cortisol, increase CRH, right? Increased CRH leads to increased ACTH. Increased ACTH leads to increased cortisol. Once the cortisol is increased, goes to talk to hypothalamus, decreases the CRH, then decreased CRH leads to again decreased ACTH because of the negative feedback loop, right? So let's talk about pituitary now. We have actually two pituitaries, right? That's one of the biggest mistakes students make, is treating the pituitary as one organ. It's really two different organs joined together. First is anterior pituitary, known as adenohypophysis. Now, adenohypophysis. Okay, I'm gonna break that down. So first is anterior pituitary, that is anterior. Think of it like a factory. Okay, it synthesizes the hormones. It receives these commands from hypothalamus, right, through the blood. That's important as well to know. And second is we have posterior pituitary, that is neurohypophysis. Now this is like a storehouse, like a warehouse. Okay, it doesn't make its own hormones. It stores the hormones that are already produced by hypothalamic neurons, right? So this is the important difference between anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary stores and anterior pituitary produces. Anterior pituitary uses the blood. Okay, let's talk about blood versus neurons. Okay, so first of all, why they are different. Anterior pituitary, right, we have this anterior pituitary that's present anterior, right? So hypothalamus sends these hormones through the hypophyseal portal system. Now what is this hypophyseal portal system? This is a specialized portal venous network. Note I said venous. Okay, it's not an arterial system, it's a venous system. Now these hormones tell anterior pituitary what to secrete. This is a blood-based communication system. So anterior pituitary talks to hypothalamus via hypophyseal portal system, right? And we call anterior pituitary as adenohypophysis. I hope you can understand this, right? Let's talk about okay. So what about posterior pituitary? Well, posterior pituitary, it has these hypothalamic neurons, right? They extend their axons all the way into the posterior pituitary itself. Now in the posterior pituitary we have ADH, oxytocin, right? These two hormones, they travel inside the axons and they are stored in the nerve terminals until they are released, right? This is a neural communication, not a portal, not a hypophyseal portal venous system. Okay, this is a neural system. This is why posterior pituitary is considered as an extension of the brain. This is very important to know, right? So let's classify these hormones. They are getting a little bit confusing. So hypothalamus talks to anterior pituitary, right? Let's organize them. We are going to talk about just anterior pituitary right now. Okay, so hypothalamus talks to anterior pituitary. Which hormones? So hypothalamus produces something which is called as GnRH, right? Then GnRH goes to anterior pituitary, and what is released? LH and FSH. When TRH is released by hypothalamus, it goes and it releases TSH. Okay, so TRH produces TSH. What about GH, growth hormone? GRH. RH is just releasing hormone. Okay, whenever you see RH, that is releasing hormone. Okay, that these are commands. These are commands sent by hypothalamus. Okay, so GHRH, GRH, right? So GHRH produces growth hormone, right? And what about CRH? CRH is producing ACTH. Okay, what about dopamine? Dopamine works and talks to anterior pituitary, and then anterior pituitary lowers down prolactin. And then we have somatostatin, that is, it also lowers down GH and TSH. Note that somatostatin lowers GH, it lowers GH, and it lowers TSH as well. Okay, so everything, note that almost everything stimulates, but only dopamine and somatostatin inhibit. That asymmetry is very important to understand. Okay, so we have one exception as well. Most hypothalamic hormones are like pressing the accelerator, right? But dopamine and somatostatin are these two different hormones. Not hormones, I mean these are commands, right? They produce these hormones, right? I mean they are, I mean in nature they are hormones, of course, but they are kind of commands, right? When they originate from hypothalamus, right? So Dopamine is actually pressing brakes on prolactin secretion all the time, right? This single fact will explain these concepts about pituitary stalk syndrome. It will explain you the prolactinoma. It will explain you dopamine agonists, right? It will even explain you. It will even help you to understand this antipsychotic induced hyperprolactinoma, right? Hyperprolactinemia, right? So we'll understand that later on, right? So in this chapter, we understood that we have these hormones, right? ADH, oxytocin on the posterior side. On the anterior side, we have this GnRH, TRH, GHRH, right? And they talk to these certain hormones. Okay, simple, right? So the whole that's the first chapter, right? So hypothalamus is the master regulator, anterior pituitary synthesize hormones, right? And that's how it really I mean, it is, right? Posterior does not synthesize anything. It stores, right? And stores and releases ADH, right? Antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. And both of these hormones are actually made in hypothalamus, while the anterior pituitary hormones are actually synthesized inside the anterior pituitary while they receive commands from hypothalamus. That's important. Okay, so the chapter 1 is over now. You can pause and think about it. So this is chapter number 2. Chapter number 2 is anterior pituitary from, right? Let's understand anterior pituitary from a different point of view, right? Now let's ask ourselves, why do releasing hormone even exist, right? I mean, why we have this portal system, why they are releasing, why they are inhibiting, why this is such a mess, right? You think it's a mess, but actually it's not, right? Before even we memorize this thing that GnRH leads to LH and FSH, TRH leads to TSH, and CRH leads to ACTH, and GHRH, that is growth hormone releasing RH, right? That is releasing hormone, it releases GH. Let's answer something much really deeper, okay? Now, first of all, how does a hypothalamus actually communicate with anterior pituitary, right? So brain has a problem, right? Imagine you're the hypothalamus. You detect that blood glucose is low, cortisol is low, right? Imagine you're the brain, okay? You detect, okay, this guy's temperature is low as well. This guy's estrogen is rising. This guy's osmolarity is rising, right? Now you must tell the pituitary to respond, right? But how are you gonna do that? Well, we can do it in two ways, okay? First is via electrical signals like neurons, right? The problem here is that anterior pituitary is not a neural tissue. We know that already. Electric impulses won't work, so option 1 is not going to work. Second option is hormones. Now this is exactly what evolution chooses, okay? So we use hormones, and these hypothalamus secretes these tiny amounts of hormones all the time, right, in the blood. And why not just release them into the general circulation, right? Why not put them in the body, right? Why put them in this portal, hypophyseal portal venous system? Now suppose hypothalamus releases this CRH, right, into systemic circulation. Now think about this journey. Hypothalamus puts this CRH, right, the blood goes to heart and then entire body and then finally to the pituitary gland. Now that's a long way, right? The problem here is that hormone becomes much diluted, right? So huge amount would be needed. First thing, you need a lot amount because we have 5 liters of blood. We cannot produce, just I don't know, 500 ml of CRH, right? We need to produce CRH in very little amounts, right? So to solve that, we had this little portal system, okay? So many tissue would be unnecessarily exposed as well, right? Because we are producing the CRH and it's going into systemic circulation. That's a problem right there. And the last problem is that it's very slow, it's a long way, hypothalamus and then heart and then entire body and then finally pituitary. Now the hypophyseal portal system is there to solve these problems, right? Instead of sending these hormones around the whole body, the hypothalamus built this private bloodstream system, right? And think of it as a very private system, okay? So hypothalamus produces these commands, maybe these commands, right? And this then hypothalamus talks to this thing which is called as primary capillary plexus. Now this actually feeds into this portal vein. Now this portal vein goes to the secondary capillary plexus, and then eventually we have anterior pituitary. So we have now these portal vein is not of the liver. First of all, we have another portal vein, okay? Portal vein is just a word we use everywhere, okay? So this hypophyseal portal system has 3 parts. Primary capillary plexus, it goes and feeds into portal vein, and then portal vein goes and feeds into secondary capillary plexus, okay? So the hormone travels in few centimeters, okay? So it's very fast, very concentrated, very little hormone is required, and super duper specific. That's very important, and this is why the hypophyseal portal system is one of the only portal system in the body, right? and it's super duper fast. Okay, so what is releasing hormone exactly, right? What is releasing command exactly, right? The hypothalamus doesn't make thyroid hormone, especially, right? Thyroid hormone is made by whom? Thyroid gland, right? It makes TRH, right? Why? Because TRH is not the final product. TRH is just an instruction, right? So hypothalamus produces this instruction, this command. TRH itself goes to the pituitary, anterior pituitary, then the workers there in the anterior pituitary starts producing this final, and then we have that final hormone later on, right? So hypothalamus is just a manager and pituitary is the factory itself, right? Now, why does every hormone ends in RH? First of all, right? I already told you, RH means releasing hormone. For example, GnRH. What is GnRH? GnRH releasing gonadotropins, right? Gonadotropin releasing hormone. What is TRH? TRH means TSH releasing hormone, right? Releases TRH. What is CRH? CRH is, it releases this RH, that is releases that ACTH. It's a RH, right? What about GHRH? It releases GH. Okay, so they are not named after what they do in the body. They are named after what they tell the pituitary to release, right? And then why is dopamine different, right? Right, this is super duper famous, right? Everything so far has been stimulated, but suddenly we read about dopamine and it's inhibiting, right? It inhibits prolactin. Why? Because why would, I mean, think about it, why would evolution design one hormone constantly suppressing another one? Because prolactin is dangerous if it's active all the time. Think about it. Prolactin function is to stimulate milk, right? Milk production. Should everyone continuously produce milk? Obviously not, because producing milk is very ATP consumption. It's sorry, consumptive. It's really expensive for us to produce milk, right? So obviously not. So instead of waiting to activate that prolactin, the body keeps prolactin, under constant inhibition. So hypothalamus continuously releasing dopamine, and that continuously released dopamine actually keeps the prolactin off. So if you have lower levels of dopamine, you will produce milk, right? So only when inhibition is removed, the prolactin rises. So this explains why these question even exist, right? Let's talk about pulsatile and continuous secretion, right? One of the most tested principle is that, okay, why doesn't hypothalamus simply releases or secrete GnRH all the time? Because pituitary receptors adapt. That's the problem. If pituitary receptors were like too stupid, the GnRH will be continuously, secreted. But continuous stimulation of any receptor desensitizes it, right? Imagine someone ringing your doorbell, okay? They ring the doorbell once, okay, you answer. Who is it, right? Now imagine someone hold that, doorbell continuously. Eventually you'll stop even, hearing that doorbell, and eventually you'll stop responding. The cell kind of behaves similarly, right? Continuous stimulation, receptors actually go inside. We call that internalization, right? It goes inside, signal decreases. This is called down regulation. Now, to avoid that down regulation, we have pulsatile release of hormones, right? So GnRH is pulsatile, right? Normally GnRH is a pulse, right? It releases LH and FSH is released, right? Then it's a pause, and then next pulse comes, right? So it's a wave, right? And there's a pause between each wave. And the pause actually allows the receptor to recover, right? Continuous GnRH will make just make these pituitary receptors down regulate for GnRH. So we need to make sure these receptors are super duper fresh, right? So this is why continuous GnRH, right, agonists such as drugs such as called leuprolide, right, after initial flare suppress this gonadal axis and are used to treat the condition like prostate cancer and even endometriosis, right? So it's cool, I think, right? So you can think about it, like a lot of questions they ask you for that. What about negative feedback? When the negative feedback starts, well, suppose your cortisol is rising, right? Should the CRH continues increasing? No, because your cortisol is rising, right? The hypothalamus constantly asks that, hey, do we have enough? If the answer is yes to that, it reduces this simulation. Every major endocrine axis works this way, okay? Low hormone leads to hypothalamus increasing that RH, that command, and then pituitary increasing that trophic hormone, okay? Now that peripheral gland also increases the hormone, and once the hormone is increased, hormone reaches to the normal levels. Once the levels are achieved, the hypothalamus decreases the RH. This is called endocrine homeostasis, okay? Okay, so we have 6 type of hypothalamic hormones. First is GnRH, okay? Second is TRH, okay? We have CRH, okay? We have GHRH, dopamine, and somatostatin. So dopamine and somatostatin, the last two are inhibitory in nature. The rest of the 4, GnRH, TRH, CRH, GHRH, are actually opposite of inhibitory. What is opposite of inhibitory? I forgot the word. We just they accelerate. Okay, they produce. I'm so sorry. So GnRH leads to increased LH and FSH. Main function is that TRH, that is RH increases what? It increases TSH, okay? And ACTH is increased by CRH, and GHRH increases GH, right? So GH, growth hormone, ACTH is stress hormone, TSH, thyroid, right? Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, right? That, and G and RH is for the reproduction. Dopamine leads to that less prolactin, and then lactation breaks happen, right? Occur. Somatostatin leads to less GH and less TSH, so it's a general inhibitor, right? So every major physiological system has its own hypothalamic command, right? So reproduction, growth, stress, everything is, everything is taken care, by hypothalamus, and hypothalamus truly act as a master coordinator here, okay? Now, let's see what happens if the pieces falls, right? Imagine your portal vessels is destroyed, right? Can hypothalamus hormone reach the anterior pituitary? Absolutely not, right? So most anterior pituitary hormone fall because they lose the stimulatory input. Exception is that prolactin, because it loses dopamine inhibition. That's a single exception, and it's very super duper high, right? So imagine you have a stock problem, you have a pituitary, you have a portal system is destroyed, right, somehow, and then you will have less inhibition on prolactin, and then just prolactin is gonna shoot up, right? What about GnRH? GnRH becomes continuous instead of pulsatile. Let's imagine that. If that happens, then we will have GnRH receptor downregulate. Once we have that downregulation, we have LH and FSH also gonna go down, and then we're gonna have to have hypogonadism, right? And what about hypothalamus? If hypothalamus is secreting a lot of CRH, what we're going to have is a lot of ACTH going to shoot up, and then we're going to have a lot of cortisol. Until the negative feedback, eventually suppresses the CRH, right? We'll have this disease, right? And so I just talked about this second chapter, which was about a little bit detailed, right? So this is the end of the second chapter. So in the end, the second chapter, we talked about anterior pituitary communicates to hypothalamus through hypophyseal portal system, not neurons. Hypothalamic releasing hormone acts as instructor, not hormones, right? GnRH is pulsatile, not continuous, to avoid downregulation. Dopamine is one of the most tonic inhibitor of prolactin, and somatostatin inhibits almost everything. That is GH, TSH, right? So very important, right? So that's end of the chapter 2. You can pause and now think. So let's start the chapter 3. In this chapter, we'll understand G and RH, okay? So G and RH, right, leads to increased LH and FSH. Why are these two gonadotropins, that is LH and FSH, right? Why they exist? Why do we need them? First question, right? We want to think about it. Second is, why do we need Leydig cells? Why do we need Sertoli cells, theca cells, and granulosa cells? So I named 4 cells, right? Why can't this one cell do everything, right? And what are these cells specially, right? So this is super duper high yield, okay? So just listen to me, okay? So we have this puberty, right? We have testosterone, estrogen, infertility, PCOS, Klinefelter syndrome, right? Androgen insensitivity, aromatase deficiency. A lot of questions, right, about them. A lot of people will think that, hey, a lot of people just memorize this thing that LH is Leydig and FSH is Sertoli without even understanding that. Let's understand them, right? So what is the goal of reproduction system? First of all, forget about hormones. What is reproduction trying to accomplish? Okay, so there are 2 biological goals. First is to produce sex hormone, that is testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. These are 3 sex hormones. Goal number 2 is to produce these mature gametes like sperm and eggs, right? So these are 2 different goals, right? Nature therefore assigns 2 different workers, right? So why these 2 pituitary hormones, right? Why do we have them? To answer that, we have to imagine one hormone that's trying to control everything. Suppose testosterone production, let's just suppose testosterone production needs to increase, right? Should the sperm production also increase? Not necessarily, right? Sometimes hormone production and gamete production need to be different, right? Sometimes they need to be on a different regulation. So evolution solved this by making LH a different hormone and FSH a different hormone, okay? So LH is different and FSH is different, right? So hormone production specialist is going to be FSH, right? Sorry, LH. And gamete production specialist going to be FSH. So LH is hormone specialist like testosterone, estrogen, right? And FSH is going to talk to gamete, okay? So the idea is to have different regulation on first the sex hormone and on different regulation on gametes, the mature gametes, right? Let's talk about male reproduction factor right now, okay? Imagine you're inside this testes, right? So there are 2 important endocrine cell types. In testes, we have outside tubes. These outside tubes have Leydig cells, okay, on the outside. On the inside, we have these seminiferous tubules, right? They have Sertoli cells. That is very important to know the location. Inside, we have Sertoli cells. Inside them, right? Sertoli cells are present where? Sertoli cells are present inside the seminiferous tubule, right? And these seminiferous tubules are present inside of the testis, right? On the outer side of the testis, we have these tubules, right? And these tubules have Leydig cells, right? Now let's talk about Leydig cells. We are going from out to in. So why are Leydig cells outside? First of all, right? Why are Leydig cells outside the seminiferous tubule, right? Because they are endocrine. Their job is hormone production, the sex hormone production. They don't directly touch the sperm, okay? So their product goes inside the blood. So LH needs to bind with Leydig cell, right? So GnRH leads to increase LH. Then LH goes to Leydig cell, which is present on the outside of the testes, right? And then this Leydig produces testosterone. And then it's so good that these Leydig cells are present on the outside. They're always bathing in blood, and then right away we have testosterone produced, and testosterone like jumps inside the blood. So that's LH. That's all LH does in a male, right? Doesn't mess with sperm, doesn't mess with inhibin, doesn't mess with aromatase, doesn't have to do with anything. So LH is testosterone Leydig, okay? That's it. Only androgen production, okay? Now, where does the testosterone actually comes from, right? You would think that, oh, it comes from it just comes from, I don't know where it comes from. A lot of people don't know. It just comes from cholesterol. So if anyone tells you like, hey, you need to decrease your cholesterol levels, okay, maybe they're right, but how are you going to make your sex hormone if you eat less cholesterol? Because cholesterol leads to what? Pregnenolone, right? Pregnenolone, pregnenolone, right? And then this pregnenolone goes to progesterone, right? So we need progesterone. And then we have this enzyme called 17-OH intermediates, right? These actually convert the progesterone into DHEA. And then this DHEA is super duper potent, right? So this super duper potent DHEA transforms into androstenedione, and then this androstenedione actually transforms into testosterone. Now every steroid hormone starts with cholesterol. That's very important. So no cholesterol, no testosterone, no estrogen. That's why you need to eat cholesterol, and eggs are full of cholesterol, okay? So that's LH story right there. What about Sertoli cells? Sertoli cells are present inside these seminiferous tubules. Now these seminiferous tubules are inside the testis, like on a deeper level, right? So inside these Sertoli cells, we have these nurse cells, right? Now what does these nurse cells do? They don't become patients, first of all. They support the patient, right? So likewise, Sertoli cells don't become sperm. They help the sperm to develop. So FSH stimulates Sertoli cells, right? So GnRH produces FSH, okay? Not produces, increases the level of FSH. And then FSH talks to Sertoli cells. Then Sertoli cells support spermatogenesis. Note, FSH does not directly make sperm. It activates Sertoli cells, okay? I'm sorry. So, Sertoli cell, it is supporting the spermatogenesis, okay? Sertoli cells then create a proper environment, okay? What do Sertoli cells actually produce then, right? This is much more than actual support, okay? So Sertoli cells produces something called as ABP, androgen binding protein. Why? Because testosterone must stay concentrated inside seminiferous tubule. ABP grabs that testosterone that was produced by LH, right? Grabs that testosterone, keep the local testosterone very high. Without ABP, without androgen binding protein, the testosterone diffuses away inside the blood and sperm production will fall away, okay? That's the first thing. Second thing that this Sertoli cell produces is called inhibin B. Now it's very important. Why make inhibin, right? Because FSH cannot stay elevated forever. Imagine if you have too much FSH. If there is too much FSH, you'll have too much Sertoli stimulation, you'll have too much ABP, you'll have too much spermatogenesis. That's the problem. So we don't want to have intense amount of FSH. System become really unbalanced, right? So Sertoli cells report back, right? How? We have increased FSH. So Sertoli cells is activated. Inhibin is released. Once the inhibin is released, it goes to the pituitary, talks to the pituitary, and tells the pituitary to lower the FSH level so that we have less Sertoli cell activation, right? So this is a negative feedback loop. So inhibin specifically just suppresses FSH, not LH, okay? Then the last thing that this Sertoli cell produces is called anti-Mullerian hormone called AMH. Now very important in fetal life, okay? AMH destroys Mullerian ducts in male. Without AMH, a genetic male develops female internal structures. Now this is very high yield. If you don't have AMH, you're gonna develop these ovaries, these things, right? That's very important. Testosterone, right? Testosterone alone cannot make sperm. That's very important. This is a big misconception. People and students think that testosterone leads to sperm. Wrong. You need both. What? You need LH and you need FSH. You need both. So we need LH for Leydig, and then Leydig produces testosterone, right? And now we have testosterone. Then we need FSH. FSH activates Sertoli, and then it produces this ABP, and then ABP attracts that, just keeps that testosterone locally high, and then we have normal spermatogenesis, right? If either side fails, the fertility is gonna drop. Okay. What about females? Well, the ovary follows exactly same logic. Again, two job: hormones and egg. These are two different things. Again, two major cell type. We have Thika, that is the female version of Leydig cell. This analogy make endocrine easy, right? So male we have Leydig that talks to LH, produces testosterone. In female we have Thika that's also producing androgen, right? So Thika cells also respond to LH just like Leydig. So LH talks to Thika in women, and then we have something which is called as androstenedione, right? It's the precursor of testosterone. So androstenedione makes testosterone later on. But wait, why would ovaries make testosterone, right? Because estrogen cannot be synthesized directly. That's the rule, okay? So it must first be made from androgen. The estrogen will always be produced by androgen. This is one of the most important concepts, okay? So that's the first type of cell, Thika, right? What about granulosa? Well, these granulosa are female Sertoli cells. Granulosa cells primarily respond to FSH. Their job includes support follicle growth, right? Produce this inhibin, express something which is called as aromatase, and convert this aromatase into estrogen, right? So aromatase does all of that. Okay, so that's the thing, right? This symmetry is present, and just nature nature gave this thing to us, right? So we have two cells, two gonadotropin theory, right? Really important thing. And neither ovarian cells can produce estrogen alone, or Thika cells, or they have to work together. That's what I'm trying to get to. Okay, so LH, Thika, androgen, right? Diffuse, then granulosa, right? And then LH stimulates these aromatase, and then we have estrogen, right? This is called two gonadotropin model. Okay, so cell one is Thika, which talks to LH and then produces this androgen. Once we have that androgen, there, we have these granulosa cells that talk to FSH. And then once granulosa are activated, granulosa produces aromatase, and this aromatase actually converts the androgen into estrogen. So no Thika, then we have no androgen, right? So no estrogen, no granulosa, no aromatase, no conversion. Androgen is gonna just accumulate, and then estrogen is gonna fall, and this woman is gonna become a man, right? So this model, this whole two cell theory model, explain PCOS, okay, aromatase deficiency, menopause, physiology, and other question you can think about them, right? Let's break the system. If LH is absent, imagine. So if LH is absent in male, you will have problems in what? In testosterone, in Leydig cells. In females, you will have Thika problems, right? So very little androgen, very little to convert, right? So very little estrogen. Let's talk if FSH is absent. If FSH is absent, then Sertoli cell inactivation, no ABP, right? If we don't have ABP, we don't have androgen binding protein. The local environment is gonna, not have high concentration of testosterone, and then we're gonna not produce spermatogenesis, right? We're not gonna do any spermatogenesis. In female, granulosa cells are inactivated. We're not gonna produce any aromatase. If we don't have aromatase, we're gonna have high levels of androgen but less levels of estrogen, because aromatase converts these androgen into estrogen, right? So what about aromatase deficiency? What about if your granulosa cells are messed up? If granulosa cells, are messed up, they cannot convert androgen into estrogen, right? And the cool thing about this here is that this aromatase is actually present in the fat cells, right? So you need to have fat to convert androgen into testosterone. You need not to be very skinny. That's very important, right? So the takeaway from this lesson is that LH is the hormone factory, FSH is the fertility factory. LH talks to Leydig, Thika, androgen. FSH talks to Sertoli, granulosa, and it produces gametes, and it produces gamete support. It produces inhibin that lowers the FSH, and it produces aromatase. So this single concept actually will help you to solve a lot of questions, right? So that's end of the chapter 3. Pause the video and just think about it once, okay? Now let's talk about TRH, okay? So this chapter is about TRH. Why does thyroid need TSH, first of all? So that's the whole chain. TRH leads to TSH. TSH leads to thyroid, okay? You should know that. Now, why does thyroid need TSH? First of all, first question is that why doesn't thyroid just make thyroid hormone by itself, right? And why does the TRH also need to stimulate prolactin? That's important. So we have three questions. One of the coolest endocrine axis. I love it. So instead of memorizing this TRH, TSH, T3, T4, let's understand the system, right? So first question. First question is, why do we need thyroid hormone, right? What is thyroid hormone actually trying to do? So the bigger picture is about metabolism. Thyroid hormone is basically body's catalyst of metabolism, body's metabolic accelerator. Imagine your body is a factory. Without thyroid hormone, the machine will move really slowly, right? The oxygen consumption will decrease, heartbeat will get slower, brain develops poorly, especially in infancy, okay? So without thyroid hormone, everything speeds up. Okay, so with without thyroid hormone everything speeds down. That's what I'm saying. With thyroid hormone everything speeds up. So more T3 T4 cells consume more oxygen. This is very important to know. And more ATP production is done then, and then more heat is produced. So higher metabolism, right? That's how it works. So thyroid hormone doesn't perform work, it tells the cell to increase your metabolic activity. Now, why doesn't thyroid hormone produce continuously? That's very important. Suppose thyroid hormone is producing hormone independently, right? Imagine on Monday you need high metabolism. Imagine on Tuesday you need low metabolism. Imagine on Wednesday you need high again. Now, how would the thyroid know? It can't, right? So to solve that problem, it has no idea whether you're fasting, whether you're cold, whether you're sleeping, whether you're working out, right? Someone has to coordinate everything. That someone is called hypothalamus. This is how the hypothalamus comes inside the picture. So the entire thyroid axis is simply on three levels. Level 1, we have hypothalamus. Hypothalamus produces TRH. Then this TRH talks to anterior pituitary. So this anterior pituitary is level 2. So level 1 was hypothalamus, level 2 is anterior pituitary. So TRH talks to anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary releases TSH, not TCH, TSH. Now this TSH talks to thyroid gland, that is level 3. So we have three levels: hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and thyroid gland, right? So on level 3, this thyroid gland produces T3 and T4. So we have three organs and we have three different hormones, but the axis is same. Now, why three levels instead of one? Because each level asks a different question. The first level, level 1, hypothalamus asks, does the body need more metabolism? Right? It's a broader question. Then the pituitary, level 2, asks, should I stimulate thyroid? Right? And then on the level 3, the thyroid hormone, the thyroid gland asks like, hey, how much should I produce? How much the body needs the thyroid? Right? So each level has a own checkpoint, right? This makes regulation super duper fine, right? Super duper precise. So let's talk about TRH. TRH is produced by hypothalamus. Of course, TRH stands for thyrotropin releasing hormone. RH releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone. Produced by hypothalamus, goes and talk to anterior pituitary. Its job is to just tell the thyrotroph cells that are present inside the anterior pituitary that to release TSH. Which cells? Thyrotroph cells. Okay, they release these TSH and nothing more. Then we have this TSH. This TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. Simple name. It stimulates the thyroid. What exactly does TSH stimulate? Many students think, oh, TSH stimulates T3. Not enough. We want to know. TSH stimulates every step of thyroid hormone synthesis, right? Including what? Including the iodine uptake, including the thyroglobulin synthesis, including thyroid peroxidase activity, including hormone release, including the thyroid growth of the gland itself. So think TSH as a thyroid master regulator or master switch, whatever you want to call it, okay? Now, why does TSH makes the thyroid bigger, right? Why do we have this goiter, right? Why does prolonged TSH causes goiter? Because stimulation doesn't just increase hormone production, it also increases cell growth, cell division, and protein synthesis. So chronic stimulation leads to hypertrophy and hyperplasia of the thyroid gland, and then hence we call this disease, not disease, we call maybe a disease depending on person to person. Then we call this situation as goiter. And this concept explains a lot of things, like why and how is thyroid hormone actually made, right? A lot of people think that, hey, we have T3 and T4. No, but where do they come from, right? Let's build it. Let's build it step by step, okay? So the first thing that we need is tyrosine, an amino acid. It's amino acid, right? So if you're low on tyrosine, you're not gonna make T3 T4. You're not gonna make thyroid hormone. So you need tyrosine. Second thing we need is iodine. It can be obtained by diet, right? The third thing we need is thyroglobulin, right? This thyroglobulin acts like a scaffold, okay? Everything happens on thyroglobulin. That's very important, right? Thyroglobulin is the platform. So simply what happens is that tyrosine binds with iodine, then it produces something which is called as MIT or MIT. Then MIT is changed into DIT, and then we have a coupling, and then after the coupling we have T3 and T4. This is simple. I just say simple pathway, okay? You don't need to memorize everything. You just need to know that we need tyrosine, we need thyroglobulin, and we need iodine. And then we have MIT and DIT. And then the coupling happens, and then we have T3 and T4, right? So if you don't have iodine, you will have no thyroid hormone. Now, why is T4 made more than T3? You should know that. Well, you should know that T4 is made more than T3. So first question is, which hormone is the more active one? First of all, T3 is more active one. Which hormone is produced more? T4 is produced more. Like, see, it seems backward, right? But actually, it's actually very smart, because T4 is the main pro hormone, okay? Think T4 as a storage form, T3 as an active form. So peripheral tissue convert this T4 into T3 using an enzyme called deiodinase. This allows each tissue to regulate its own activity. Very awesome, right? And then we have negative feedback loop, right? Suppose thyroid hormone is very high. Should the TSH keep rising? Obviously not. So instead what happens is that, imagine you have high T3, T4, right? So it goes talk to the pituitary, then pituitary actually lowers the TSH. And then once we have lower TSH, this TSH goes and talks to hypothalamus. And then the hypothalamus is like, okay, I'm gonna lower the TRH, okay? So this is the negative feedback loop. Note that T3, T4 talks to pituitary, not hypothalamus directly. Every endocrine system follows this negative feedback loop, right? Now, why does the TRH increases prolactin? We already asked that question, first of all, right? It's very important. TRH, right? Thyrotropin releasing hormone, right? TRH primarily stimulates TSH, right? But it also stimulates prolactin. Why? The exact evolutionary reason is not really understood right now, but I think physiologically it is same hypothalamic signal that can activate both thyrotrophs and lectrotrophs in interior pituitary, right? Clinically, what matters is the consequence. I don't know why it mattered. I don't know why it happened. Honestly, I don't have an answer. But clinically, the results are important. So in hypothyroidism, hypo means less, right? We have less thyroid hormone, right? So we will have less negative feedback loop, right? If we have less negative feedback loop, hypothalamus says, "Oh my God, we need more thyroid hormone." So it increases this TRH. Once the TRH is stimulated, it increases TSH. Once the TSH increases, we have this prolactin that is increased now, and then we're gonna have hyperprolactinemia, and this explains why severe hypothyroidism patient, right, these patients have galactorrhea, amenorrhea, infertility, right, decreased libido, because without pituitary prolactinoma, right, without a pituitary prolactinoma, that's the cancer that produces prolactin, right, they have these signs of prolactinoma. And usually, whenever you see a patient of prolactinoma, you want to cancel this disease of hypothyroidism. Okay, that's a very simple step. Okay, so let's try to break the system a little bit. Suppose we destroy the thyroid gland. Can it produce T3, T4? No. So T3, T4 goes down. Feedback lost is done, right? You'll have less negative feedback loop. So what's the result? Increased TRH, increased TSH. What's the diagnosis? Primary hypothyroidism, right? The problem is at the gland itself, so that's called primary hypothyroidism. Suppose let's destroy the pituitary in some way. So hypothalamus works. Like, pituitary is destroyed, but hypothalamus is okay and thyroid is okay. So what's going to happen? We're going to have no TSH because pituitary produces TSH. We're going to have high TRH and low TSH, and then low T3 and T4. What's this diagnosis? The diagnosis is secondary hypothyroidism, right? Because it's due to not primary cause. The primary cause is being destroyed. The primary cause is thyroid getting destroyed. Secondary cause is pituitary getting destroyed. Now at level 3, let's destroy the hypothalamus. So we destroy it. What's going to happen? We're going to have less TRH. What's going to happen later? We're going to have less TSH. What's going to happen later? We're going to have less T3 and T4. We call this thing as tertiary hypothyroidism, right? So the location determines the hormone pattern, right? Primary, we destroy the thyroid hormone itself. It's not the hormone. The gland will have high TRH, high TSH, right? And low T3, T4. Secondary, we destroy the anterior pituitary, right? We're gonna have increased TRH, right? We're gonna have less TSH because the pituitary is destroyed, and then we're gonna have low T3, T4, right? And then tertiary, right? We're gonna have destroyed hypothalamus. So once we have destroyed hypothalamus, we're gonna have less TSH, less TRH, less T3, T4. Everything's gonna go down, right? In primary hypothyroidism, on the primary level, we're going to have what? We're going to have some sort of hyperplasia and hypertrophy of what? Of the gland itself. So T3, T4 goes up, but due to the negative feedback loop, we're going to have less TSH and less TRH. That is primary hypothyroidism, right? Don't need to memorize anything. We just want to ask, where is the lesion? Where is the problem? So this is the end of the chapter 4, and we talked about just we talked about these, TSH, TRH. So the summary of this chapter is that TRH stimulates both TSH and prolactin. TSH, that is produced by anterior pituitary, stimulates hormone synthesis, secretion, and thyroid. T4 is the major circulating hormone. T3 is one of the more biological active one. T4 is like a storage. TSH stimulation causes goiter. Primary hypothyroidism is then when we destroy the gland itself. Secondary is when we destroy the pituitary, and the tertiary is then when we destroy the hypothyroidism. Okay, so that's how it follows, right? So this is the end of the chapter 4. Pause the video and just try to think. That's it. So this is chapter number 5, and we're going to talk about CRH. CRH leads to ACTH, leads to cortisol. This chapter is about cortisol, okay? Why does the body need cortisol? First thing, you call it stress hormone, right? Why is cortisol even called stress hormone, right? Why doesn't the adrenal gland simply secrete cortisol by itself? We're going to answer these 3 questions, right? This alone chapter is going to explain you Cushing, Addison, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, pituitary adenomas, adrenal adenomas, steroid pharmacy a little bit, and then we understand shock and critical illness, right? So a lot of people will just memorize CRH, ACTH, cortisol. Well, they're not wrong, but we're going to understand them deeply, why the evolution built the system. Imagine you're walking in a forest, okay? Suddenly, you see a tiger. A tiger appears, right? What should your body do? Should it digest? Should it grow? Should it do reproduction at this specific time? Especially not, because those are luxury function. Right now, the main goal is to survive. So body switches into survival mode, right? And what does this survival mode require? It requires more glucose. Muscles need fuel, brain need fuel, running requires ATP. That's first thing. Second thing is to maintain the blood perfusion. You need a good blood pressure. If the blood pressure falls, oxygen delivery falls, ATP falls, death follows quickly. The third thing you want to know is we want to reduce any sort of unnecessary activity like growth. We can grow later. Like immune system can wait. The priority is to run. Like digestion, well, we can digest later. The priority is to run away from the tiger, right? This is exactly what cortisol does. Cortisol is not an emergency hormone, right? Emergency hormones are epinephrine, right? Epinephrine is an emergency hormone. Cortisol is like a stress to survive hormone, right? So students confuse epinephrine with cortisol. Think of the timing, okay? Epinephrine works fast, seconds, immediately, fight to flight. That's an emergency. Cortisol works in hours. It's a long-term adaptation, okay? So stress leads to epinephrine. Oh my God, I'm shitting my pants. There's a tiger in front of me. Now the cortisol comes, keeps you alive for the next several hours. The one is immediate, the other one is sustained. That's the idea of epinephrine and cortisol. Let's talk about the cortisol whole axis. Exactly like how thyroid works, we have 3 levels. First level is hypothalamus, second level is anterior pituitary, and the third level is adrenal cortex. Okay, so hypothalamus produces CRH at level 1. At level 2, we have anterior pituitary that produces ACTH, and then at level 3, we have adrenal cortex that produces cortisol. Every endocrine axis has a controller, that's the hypothalamus, and then we have a middle manager, that's anterior pituitary, you can call it, and then we have a organ, right, that produces that specific hormone. So ACTH does not actually stimulate the entire adrenal gland. This is very important. ACTH is produced by whom? By anterior pituitary from level 2, right? So ACTH does not stimulate the entire adrenal gland. ACTH leads to adrenal. Wrong. ACTH stimulates only one layer. Let's understand why. We need to understand adrenal anatomy right now, okay? So adrenal gland organization, this is how it's organized, right? Adrenal gland has 2 completely different organs fused together. Adrenal gland. First thing, it has a cortex, the outer layer, and then it has a medulla. So why? Because we have different embryology. These 2 glands, they come from different embryological reasons. We have different hormones, different regulation, different disease. Don't want to mix them up. Adrenal cortex is different. Adrenal medulla is different. The cortex, the outside part, has 3 layers. we have the first layer, the most outside layer is called glomerulosa. Second layer is called fasciculata, and the third layer, that's the most inside, is called reticularis. Okay, remember that GFR, right? Like kidney filtration, right? Student, remember GFR, right? So just GFR, glomerulosa, F is fasciculata, and R is reticularis. Okay, so GFR, it's not the kidney function. Okay, just remember that. So G is the most outside, F is middle one, and R is the most inside one, reticularis. Okay. Now, what does each layer produce exactly? First thing. So let's start from the outside one. Okay. So we have G, glomerulosa, sorry, not lesa, glomerulosa, right? So talks to salt. The mnemonic is salt, okay, SALT, right? And this G, glomerulosa, produces aldosterone, okay? So glomerulosa, the most outside one, produces aldosterone. Then we have fascicularis, right? Zona fasciculata, not fascicularis, fasciculata. So this fasciculata, on the appearance or on the presence of sugar, it produces cortisol, the hormone that we are talking. And the most inside one is for the sex, right? It produces androgen, right? So GFR is just salt, sugar, sex, triple S, okay? So salt, sugar, sex. Salt is aldosterone, sugar is cortisol, and sex is androgen, right? So GFR, glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. Okay. Which layer responds to ACTH? Only fasciculata, GFR, the middle one, F, that produces cortisol, right? The sugar one. And zona reticularis, right? What about zona reticularis? It does ACTH regulate aldosterone? Absolutely not. Okay, it does little bit, influence the R layer, the reticularis, the sex, the androgen one, but it does nothing to glomerulosa, the layer that is responsible for aldosterone. Okay, so why doesn't ACTH control aldosterone? Because aldosterone has a completely different job. When do you need aldosterone? Not necessarily during stress. You need it when blood pressure is failing, right? When sodium falls, when potassium rises. These are kidney problems. Therefore, aldosterone listens to RAS, that is angiotensin 2, and it listens to potassium, right? So this is one of the coolest thing, right? And then what does cortisol actually do? Right? Cortisol increases sugar. That's only the effect. Let's understand it. Imagine, like, really mechanically. Imagine you are starving, right? Where does the glucose come from? The liver must make it. Therefore, cortisol stimulates gluconeogenesis, right? New production of glucose from non-carb source, right? Especially from amino acids, right? And glycerol, okay? So where do the amino acids come from? The amino acids come from muscles. So cortisol breaks the muscle protein, and this explains muscle wasting in Cushing syndrome, okay? Cortisol produces this gluconeogenesis, and for gluconeogenesis you need amino acid, and these amino acids come from the muscle wasting, right? Where does the glycerol comes from? Glycerol comes from fat. Therefore cortisol increases lipolysis as well, again to make what? Again to make glucose available, to increase that blood sugar level, right? So cortisol also supports blood pressure. Okay, why does hypotension always respond to fluid? Because vessels needs catecholamine. So cortisols increases vascular responsiveness to epinephrine and norepinephrine. Cortisol has this permissive effect. So without cortisol, catecholamine will not work. This explains why a patient with adrenal crisis have severe hypotension and can have severe shock and will 100% die, and will have a very poor response to vasopressor until the steroids are given, right? So if a patient has if a patient is going through some sort of adrenal crisis, right, his adrenal gland is, or her adrenal gland is failing, you need to give steroids to make sure that blood pressure doesn't crash. So cortisol also suppresses the immune system. Wow, why? If you're escaping a tiger, is inflammation your priority? No, energy is limited. So cortisol suppresses these cytokines, T cells, macrophages, inflammation, etc., etc. And that's why glucocorticoid, right, are powerful anti-inflammatory drugs. That's why we give them, because cortisol inhibits that. What about circadian rhythm? Well, does cortisol stays constant? No. Highest is in the 8 a.m. and lowest is around the midnight. Why is that? Because you need energy to wake up. right? So hypothalamus synchronizes that cortisol secretion with sleep-wake cycle. This is why morning cortisol is commonly measured when evaluating the adrenal function. Okay, so when you want to measure the cortisol, you want to do it in the morning, because this is the moment when it's super high. Okay, what about the negative feedback loop? Well, cortisol goes to hypothalamus, CRH decreases. Once CRH decreases, pituitary is like, okay, I'll decrease the ACTH as well. So the ACTH also decreases, right? So this is endocrine feedback. Okay, let's break the system a little bit. Let's destroy the adrenal cortex first thing. So if the cortex is destroyed, can cortisol be made? No. If the cortisol goes down, what's going to increase? CRH is going to increase, ACTH is going to increase. So we call it what? We call it primary adrenal insufficiency, or Addison, right? So the adrenal cortex is developed, we call it primary adrenal insufficiency, or Addison, right? Imagine the level 2, the pituitary is destroyed. If the pituitary is destroyed, we'll have less ACTH, less cortisol, and we call it secondary adrenal insufficiency, right? Simple name. Suppose scenario 3, adrenal adenoma continuously, autonomously secretes cortisol. There is an adenoma, there is a cancer on your adrenal gland. We have high levels of cortisol. As a negative feedback loop, your CRH will drop. Once your CRH drops, your ACTH will drop. So this is what? This is ACTH independent, because we have an adenoma. So this is ACTH independent Cushing syndrome. Okay, that's the thing. What about pituitary adenoma, right? Suppose we have adenoma on the pituitary. It is secreting these enormous amount of ACTH. We will have less CRH, but we'll have higher amount of cortisol. What's the name of the disease? We call it Cushing, pituitary ACTH adenoma, right? So the distinction is that Cushing syndrome is excessive cortisol from any cause. That's a syndrome. Cushing disease, when I say disease, we have primary ACTH adenoma specifically. So this is very important. Disease is adenoma on pituitary, okay? And syndrome is just excessive cortisol, maybe exogenously, maybe from any other cause, okay? It's very important, okay? So we have 4 types of diseases. Primary adrenal insufficiency, where the adrenal gland is messed up, right? So you'll have less cortisol and increase CRH and increase ACTH. Then we have secondary, that is the pituitary is messed up. So secondary adrenal insufficiency, you're going to have less ACTH, and then we're going to have less cortisol and increase CRH as a negative feedback loop. And then we have an adrenal cortisol tumor, right? So there is a tumor on the adrenal gland. We're going to have high cortisols and low CRH and ACTH. And then we have a pituitary ACTH adenoma. Then we're going to have increased amount of ACTH, low amount of CRH and and we're going to have higher amount of cortisol, because that increased ACTH is going to act on the cortex, okay? Don't want to memorize anything. Just ask where the lesion is. Summary of the chapter is just simply ACTH primarily stimulates zona fasciculata, the middle one, right? GFR, glomerulosa, F is fasciculata, and R is reticularis, right? And so it acts on fasciculata, the middle layer, right? Zona glomerulosa is regulated mainly by RAS system and potassium, right? So SA, right? Salt, it talks to RAS, and potassium, it's a kidney regulator, right? Adrenal cortex, we have granulasa, that is produces aldosterone. Sugar is just fasciculata, that produces cortisol. And then we have reticularis, that's for sex, that androgen, right? So cortisol increases gluconeogenesis, that produces, muscle wasting and lipolysis, right? Protein breakdown, lipolysis, right? Vascular responsiveness due to its permissive effect on catecholamine. So without cortisol, your catecholamines will not work, and your vasoconstriction will not occur. And it also suppresses inflammation. That's why we use glucocorticoids as an excellent choice of immunosuppression, right? Cushing disease is a pituitary ACTH adenoma. It's a disease. It's not a syndrome. Syndrome can be of many causes. Disease is when you have adenoma on pituitary on the level 2. Cushing syndrome refers to any cause of cortisol excess. That's important. And primary adrenal insufficiency causes high ACTH, right? Whereas secondary adrenal insufficiency causes low ACTH, because secondary is that when we have problems at the pituitary level. So that was lesson number 5, right? And I've been speaking for 1 hour continuously. I think I'm going to take a break. So pause that video, think about what I just said, and just listen to me, okay? Now let's talk about growth hormone, right? So we have GHRH, increases growth hormone, and then growth hormone increases IGF-1. Why doesn't growth hormone directly makes you grow? Because the axis is super important, right? We're gonna answer that question, right? But you should people usually don't ask this question, that if it's called growth hormone, why doesn't it directly makes your bone grow, right? Let's start by first understanding what is growth. What do we mean when we say growth, right? When we say growth, what actually grows? First of all, bones, muscle, connective tissue, right? Growth requires cell division, protein, matrix, bone elongation. So the one hormone cannot efficiently coordinate all these different things. Okay, so therefore, that's why evolution created this middle man, middle passenger, middle messenger. So the axis is like this. We have level 1, that is hypothalamus. Okay. On level 2, we have anterior pituitary. And on level 3, we have the liver. Okay. So we have 3 levels. Hypothalamus produces GnRH, right? It positively it means it increases, it activates anterior pituitary. And then this anterior pituitary releases growth hormone. On level 3, we have liver. So this growth hormone talks to liver, and the liver produces IGF-1, and this IGF-1 later, produces these effects of bone, cartilage, muscle, etc., right? Note that hypothalamus also releases somatostatin. Now this somatostatin actually deactivates or inhibits the entire interior pituitary. That leads to lower levels of IGF-1 via liver, of course, right? So most endocrine axes, they end at endocrine gland, but growth hormones end at liver, right? So liver is the level 3 here, right? So liver then produce IGF-1 and blah blah blah, these actual growth promoting effects occur, right? So why doesn't the growth hormone directly stimulate the bone? Excellent question, right? Imagine growth hormone had to stimulate bone, cartilage, muscle, connective tissue individually, right? That's very super duper inefficient. Instead what growth hormone does is that growth hormone talks to liver, and then liver then produces IGF-1. IGF-1 becomes body universal growth signal. So growth hormone is just a manager, IGF-1 is the worker, right? So what does growth hormone actually do then, right? A lot of people think, oh, growth hormone increases height. Well, it does actually two jobs. The job one is to stimulate the growth via IGF-1. That's number one. The job number two is to provide energy for growth. Okay. Growth requires enormous amount of ATP. You need to have ATP. Therefore, growth hormone changes metabolism. Why does growth hormone increases blood glucose then? Okay. Question is that growing tissue needs glucose. Now, should growth hormone lower the glucose or increase it? Actually, no. Growth hormone raises blood glucose. Why? Because it wants to ensure that glucose remains available. Growth hormone causes increased lipolysis, that so that we have these, glycerol that can be converted into what? Glucose, right? Fat becomes the fuel. Then we have decreased glucose uptake in the muscle and fat, so that glucose is spared for the organs like brain. And then we have increased hepatic glucose production. Blood glucose rises even further. Therefore, growth hormone is a diabetogenic, anti-insulin effect. Growth hormone, pushing growth hormone inside your body can actually give you diabetes. So why IGF-1 is called IGF? First of all, what is IGF? IGF is insulin-like growth factor, right? So IGF has a structural similarity to insulin. Unlike growth hormone, IGF-1 promotes protein synthesis, cell proliferation, bone growth, cartilage growth, right? It mediates most of the GH anabolic effects, right? So what about the growth plate on the bones, right? Let's understand that. How do bones actually becomes longer or stronger? It happens only at epiphyseal growth plate. Okay, so IGF stimulates these chondrocytes. Okay, so IGF stimulates these chondrocyte proliferation. So you have these a lot, like chondrocytes are getting huge in numbers. Once it happens, it actually leads to increased cartilage expansion, and then once the cartilage is expanded enough, the ossification happens, and then eventually the bone length increases. That's how it happens. So after puberty, the growth plate actually closes. This chondrocyte proliferation cannot happen. So can GH still increase the height? No. This explains gigantism versus acromegaly. Okay, so gigantism versus acromegaly. Excess growth hormone before epiphyseal closure, right, leads to growth plates still open, bones elongate. We call that gigantism, right? When the growth plate is still open in your growing phase, right? Extremely tall, large hand, large feet. What about excess growth hormone after the epiphyseal closes? No further lengthening is possible. Instead, what happens is that you have bones becoming thicker, soft tissue enlarges. We call it acromegaly. Acro means big, or sorry, megaly means big, right? So enlarged jaw, we call it prognathism. So large hands, large feet, coarse facial features, macroglossia, that is the, thick tongue, macroglossia, right? Glossia, I don't know. Organ enlargements, right? These are like super duper clues. What about Laron syndrome? Well, what if the growth hormone was normal? Okay, just imagine. But the growth hormone receptor, the receptor that talks to growth hormone, doesn't work, right? What happens? So we'll have higher levels of growth hormone, but the receptor is defective. So liver is not going to produce any IGF, and then growth is going to fail, right? So growth failure is going to happen. We call that Laron syndrome. Okay, so we have high LH and low IGF-1 because the negative feedback is lost. Okay, what about somatostatin, right? Somatostatin, hypothalamus produces this GnRH, right? And GnRH produces GH, right? Then we have another type of the story. The story is somatostatin. Somatostatin actually inhibits growth hormone, right? One is accelerator, that is GHRH. Then the brake, somatostatin, right? So IGF-1 feeds back, right? Feedback loop. Let's understand the negative feedback loop. IGF-1 increases, hypothalamus goes down, GnRH goes down. Sorry, not GnRH, GHRH. I'm so sorry. So GHRH goes down. Once we have less levels of GHRH, we'll have higher levels of somatostatin because somatostatins are the brakes. Once we have higher levels of somatostatin, that goes and talks to pituitary, and then we'll have lower levels of GH itself. So same endocrine story, right? Let's break the system a little bit. Scene 1. Imagine pituitary adenoma secretes a lot of growth hormone. What's gonna happen? We're gonna have IGF-1. We're gonna have acromegaly in adult, and in child we're gonna have gigantism. Okay. Scenario number 2. Pituitary is destroyed. Boom. So what's gonna happen? GH is gonna go down. IGF is gonna go down. Poor growth in children. Suppose we have a liver failure. What's going to happen? IGF is going to be very low, right? So GH can be normal because GH is produced by pituitary, not by liver, right? And we have liver failure. So IGF is going to be low. Now, because the liver is the main source of IGF, right? That's the reason. Growth plates are already closed. Imagine, they closed earlier. So we're going to have higher levels of GH. So GH excess happens. Will the height increase? No, because the growth plate is closed. Only bone thickening and soft tissue hypertrophy is going to happen. Overgrowth is going to happen. So growth deficiency, right? Growth deficiency, we have less GH, less IGF, short stature, right? Pituitary GH adenoma, high amount of GH, gigantism, acromegaly, depends upon the time it happens. Laron syndrome, we have high GH, but the receptors are messed up or broken. Then we're gonna have low IGF. Once we have low IGF, we're gonna have GH resistance, and then we're gonna have also low growth as well. What about liver failure? Normal GH may be high due to negative feedback loop, right? Can be increased, and we're gonna have less IGF, and then we're gonna have less, growth. So GH is released from anterior pituitary, responds to GHRH, and inhibited by somatostatin. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is most growth promoting effects of GH are mediated by IGF-1, and which is produced by liver. And point number 3 is that growth hormone has an anti-insulin, that is diabetogenic effect. If you take exogenously growth hormone, you can have diabetes. It increases blood glucose by decreasing peripheral glucose uptake, down regulating these GLUT4, right, and increases hepatic glucose production. And excess growth hormone before epiphyseal closure leads to gigantism. After closure, it leads to acromegaly. And Laron syndrome is just when you have GH receptor deficiency. GH is high, but IGF is low. Okay, so that's your growth hormone. So this is where the chapter ends. And this is the end of chapter 6. Pause the video, understand the chapter. So this chapter number 7, the main chapter is about ADH, oxytocin, dopamine, and prolactin. Okay, so let's understand prolactin. What is prolactin's job? Why does prolactin exist? Its job is to make milk. Its job is milk production after childbirth, not milk ejection, not uterine contraction, only milk synthesis. Why prolactin is unique? Because every anterior pituitary hormone we have studied so far is mainly stimulatory. Okay, suppose CRH stimulates what? ACTH. TRH releases what? TSH. GHRH, growth hormone. But prolactin is different. Instead of stimulating, it continuously inhibits. So hypothalamus produces dopamine. Dopamine inhibits prolactin. That's important. So prolactin has a brake, not an accelerator. This is very important fact right there. Now, why continuous inhibition? Imagine prolactin was always active. Everyone would be constantly producing milk. That would be a huge waste of energy. Milk synthesis is only useful after pregnancy and during breastfeeding. Therefore, the default state is off, right? So that's why dopamine is always stopping that prolactin. What happens during breastfeeding? Baby suckles. Baby is like, oh, I'm gonna suck that. Sensory nerves on the nipple fires. Okay? Once that firing happens, your hypothalamus decreases the dopamine release. The brakes are removed, the prolactin releases, and then milk is produced, right? Notice that the baby doesn't stimulate prolactin directly. It removes that dopamine inhibition by firing that nipple sensory nerves, okay? So that's one thing. Other thing is that we have TRH, right? Thyrotropin releasing hormone, right? This TRH also stimulates prolactin, right? So TRH stimulates TSH and prolactin. Therefore, primary hypothyroidism leads to increased TRS, right? What is primary hypothyroidism? When the thyroid is destroyed, okay? So thyroid is destroyed, your T3, 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 T4 goes down. You have increased TRH due to this negative feedback loop. Once you have increased TRH, there's actually increased prolactin. You're gonna make a lot of more milk. We call it galactorrhea, right? Simple. Prolactin also inhibits GnRH, okay? Important. Why don't breastfeeding women menstruate? Why? Because prolactin suppresses GnRH. Once you have less GnRH, FSH and LH goes down, ovulation goes down, and we call it amenorrhea, right? We call it lactation amenorrhea, right? What about pituitary stalk? Imagine you have a lesion at pituitary stalk, right? Lesion means we have a problem there, okay? Suppose pituitary stalk is cut. What happens? Remember, dopamine travels from hypothalamus to pituitary, posterior pituitary. If the stalk is cut, no dopamine, no inhibition, more prolactin, the anterior pituitary hormones, all of these hormones are gonna fall. But the prolactin is the exemption, is gonna shoot up. What about drugs? Drugs like dopamine agonist. If we increases these drugs, like what? Bromocriptine, right? Cabergoline, right? They increase dopamine effect, not increase dopamine. They increase the effect of dopamine. So what's gonna happen? Prolactin is gonna fall further. So that's the good treatment for prolactinoma, right? What about antagonism of dopamine? Well, there are a lot of drugs like antipsychotics, right? You give them, they block the dopamine receptors. So brakes are removed, less dopamine. What's gonna happen? Higher prolactin levels. We're gonna have amenorrhea, gynecomastia, infertility, galactorrhea, right? These are important. What about posterior pituitary? One of the biggest misconception is that posterior pituitary does not make hormones. It's right. So sorry. What the hell I'm saying? Posterior pituitary does not make hormones. That's important. It's not a misconception. It's an important fact. It stores them. Now, where are ADH and oxytocin made? They both are synthesized in the hypothalamus itself. Then they are transported down the axons. Hypothalamus produces them. They travel down the axon. They travel and they get stored in the pituitary, posterior pituitary, and they're stored there, and then later they are released. So posterior pituitary is a warehouse, okay? What about the nucleus of hypothalamus? So we have two nucleus, supraoptic and paraventricular, okay? Supraoptic produces ADH, paraventricular produces oxytocin, okay? So supraoctave, SO, save water, okay? Paraventricular, supraoctave is ADH, and paraventricular is oxytocin, right? What about ADH? Let's talk about ADH a little bit. Why does ADH exist? Imagine you're lost in a desert. You cannot find water. Water loss is happening. Blood becomes super duper concentrated. If nothing changes, that is gonna occur. Now the body needs to make a hormone that say, do not pee, do not waste water. That is ADH. So, okay, what stimulates ADH? There are two major stimuli. The first stimuli is increased plasma osmolality, that is increased concentration. This osmolality is detected by hypothalamic osmoreceptors. Okay, so once they are activated, the ADH is released. Second thing is low blood volume detected by baroreceptors. Now these baroreceptors are stretch receptors, okay? They measure the stretch of your capillaries, okay? So they sense that, oh my god, this patient is gonna, not patient, this guy is on low blood pressure, low blood volume. Okay, let's release that ADH. Once you have that ADH, what does ADH do? ADH acts on kidney collecting tubules. Collecting tubules are the end part of kidney, okay? Specifically V2 receptors, right? So they act on V2 receptor, the ADH acts on V2 receptor, then the aquaporin channels, right? So which kind of aquaporin? Aquaporin 2. So aquaporin 2 channels are inserted, water is reabsorbed, and then urine concentrated, right? Urine is more concentrated now. So ADH add the water back, or antidiuretic hormone. Simple. That is V2. What about V1? V1 is different. V1 is located on the blood vessels, causes vasoconstriction. So V1 is vessel, V2 is kidney. What about diabetic insipidus? Well, what if the ADH is absent? Water cannot be reabsorbed, right? Large volume of water will be lost. So large volume dilute urine. Hypernatremia, polydipsia, right? So we have two types of diabetic insipidus. We have first is central diabetes, right? No ADH is produced. We treat it with desmopressin, okay? And then we have a nephrogenic diabetic insipidus, where ADH is there, yes, but the kidney cannot respond to it. Maybe due to some sort of receptor problem, maybe it's due to lithium, maybe it's due to hypercalcemia, right? Can be because of a lot of reasons. But here, the thing is, desmopressin is not going to help. So desmopressin can actually be useful to identify which type of diabetic insipidus it is. Let's talk about SIADH, syndrome of inappropriate ADH, right? Opposite problem, too much ADH, too much water will be retained. You will look very watery, right? Hyponatremia, because you are increasing this fluid, right? So the potassium, sodium, this Na levels, right? Sodium levels, they're gonna drop. We're gonna have dilute, right? So low serum osmolality, concentration urine will be really concentrated, right? And this can cause small cell lung cancer, CNS problem, SS, right? So this can be caused because of this small cell lung cancer actually causes this SIADH. It produces this ectopic ADH. CNS problems like SSRIs, carbamazepine, right? That's the problem right there. Okay, let me drink water. Let's come to oxytocin now. What do oxytocin do? Two major things. Uterine contraction during labor, positive feedback loop. Baby pushes the cervix, oxytocin is released. More contraction, baby pushes more oxytocin. This is called Ferguson reflex. Okay, so few positive feedback loops in the physiology. That's very common. Other thing is milk ejection. That's very important. Don't confuse prolactin versus oxytocin. Prolactin produces milk. Oxytocin is a push. It pushes the milk out. Very important. So prolactin milk production, oxytocin milk ejection. ADH is just water retention. Okay. Let's break the system a little bit. Dopamine is destroyed. Imagine prolactin high rises. What's gonna happen later? Posterior pituitary, right? Let's just imagine, like, posterior pituitary is destroyed. What's gonna happen? We're gonna have less ADH. We're gonna have central diabetic insipidus. Kidney resistant to ADH, nephrogenic diabetic insipidus. Excess ADH, SIADH. Oxytocin absent, poor milk letdown, weak uterine contraction, right? So the summary of this whole chapter 7 was dopamine tonically inhibits prolactin. Okay, TRH stimulates both TSH and prolactin. Prolactin suppresses GnRH, causing amenorrhea and infertility. Posterior pituitary stores and does not synthesize ADH and oxytocin. Supraoptic ADH, paraventricular oxytocin. ADH acts on V2, not V1. V1 is on the vessels for vasoconstriction. V2 is for getting the water back. Note that only water comes back, not sodium. It's a ATP. They are active transport. Prolactin is milk production. Oxytocin is milk letdown or ejection. Pituitary stalk lesion increases prolactin because dopamine inhibition is lost in that lesion. Okay, so that's it. That's the chapter number 7. So pause the video now and just think about it. So this is the last chapter on endocrine. So this is how the entire system works. Okay, we talked one by one about each system, right? We talked about GnRH, TRH, CRH, GHRH, right? All 4 of them are stimulatory. Dopamine, somatostatin are inhibitory. Okay, anterior pituitary we have LH, FSH, TSH, ACTH, GH, prolactin. They act on peripheral endocrine system, and the final hormone is produced, and then we have negative feedback loop. On the posterior side we have storage, right? Does not synthesize anything. ADH and oxytocin made in hypothalamus via their respective nucleuses, right? They travel down the axons, they are stored and they are released, right? So we have these hormones, right? And what I can talk is that I think just go back in the lesson, just rewind that video, and we already talked about almost everything, right? Let me just sum it up for you, maybe. I don't know. Let's talk about some questions, okay? let's talk about some traps that you can, actually get confused. Pituitary stalk lesion. Okay, pituitary stalk lesion is when all hormones go down. Wrong. Correct is most hormones go down, but prolactin goes up because dopamine is lost. Dopamine cannot reach pituitary. Trap 2 is primary hypothyroidism. Let's talk about. Student memorize increased TSH. They forgot about TRH. Wrong. Primary hypo means your thyroid is messed up. So first thing is that you're gonna have what? We're gonna have high TRH because the negative feedback loop is lost. Then if we have high TRH, we're gonna have high TSH, and then we're gonna have high prolactin as well. That's the problem. What about GnRH? If we have continuous GnRH, students think more GnRH. Wrong. Absolutely wrong. More GnRH does not mean more LH. We need pulsatile, okay? Pulsatile stimulation. We don't want receptor downregulation, okay? So downregulation is very important. What about ACTH? ACTH controls aldosterone. Wrong. Aldosterone mainly refers to RAS and potassium. It's a kidney hormone, okay? What about posterior pituitary synthesizer ADH? Wrong. ADH and oxytocin are synthesized in hypothalamus by their nucleuses, okay? They're just stored in posterior pituitary. Growth hormone causes growth. Of course, indirectly, yes, but most of the growth happens via IGF-1, okay? So prolactinoma, we have high prolactin, that's it. Pituitary stalk lesion, high prolactin again. Primary hypothyroidism, we have high TRH, right, and high prolactin, but low TCT4. Acromegaly, we have high GH, but it's a child. No, sorry. It's not a child, acromegaly. It's not gigantism. It's an adult, okay? That's important because the growth plate has closed. Laron syndrome, we have high GH, but the receptor is faulty. Cushing, we have ACTH pituitary adenoma. It's a disease. Cushing syndrome is that we have high cortisol, irrespective of the cause. Addison is just we have primary adrenal failure. We have problems at the adrenal gland. SIADH, syndrome of inappropriate ADH, high ADH, central diabetic. So what is diabetic insipidus? Just ADH is less. So if it's central, we have less ADH. If it's nephrogenic, the kidney is not talking to ADH. Okay. What about drugs? We have these drugs that are agonism of dopamine, that is bromocriptine and cabergoline, right? These drugs actually they increase the dopamine, and then once they increase the dopamine, you have less layers of prolactin, right? You can treat this in prolactinoma. What about leuprolide? Well, leuprolide, right, it's a continuous, right? It actually lowers LH and FSH after the receptor downregulation happens. That's why we need pulsatile release. I'm saying this again and again. Desmopressin acts on what? On V2 receptor. Will only act if the receptors are okay. Will only work in central diabetic insipidus when you know that ADH is low. What about octreotide? Octreotide is a somatostatin analog. It will lower the GH and it will lower the TSH as well, right? So try to answer this question. Which pituitary lobe synthesizes hormone? Which lobe stores hormone? Where ADH is made? Where oxytocin is made? ADH is made in supraoptic nucleus. Oxytocin is made in paraventricular nucleus in the hypothalamus. What inhibits prolactin? Dopamine. Which hormone stimulates prolactin besides dopamine? TRH. Which hormone suppresses GnRH? Prolactin. Which receptor inserts the aquaporin 2? V2. Which receptor causes vasoconstriction? V1. Right? Which adrenal zone produces cortisol? The middle one, fasciculata. Which zone produces aldosterone? The outermost one, the glomerulosa. Main regulator of aldosterone, RAS and potassium, right? Which hormone acts on IGF-1? GH, right? GH axis causes gigantism in puberty, and after puberty it causes acromegaly, right? Continuous GnRH causes what? Less GH, less FSH. Pituitary stalk lesion causes what? Prolactin levels to be really high, okay? Because we have lost inhibition of oxytocin. It's not oxytocin, sorry, dopamine, right? Milk production, high prolactin, right? Milk ejection, oxytocin. Why do endocrine function uses endocrine axis use negative feedback loop? To maintain hormone homeostasis, right? To prevent any sort of overproduction. So hypothalamus, main guy. Anterior pituitary, factory. Posterior pituitary, warehouse. LH, hormone production. FSH, fertility thing, right? TSH, thyroid. ACTH, cortisol. GH, IGF-1. Dopamine, prolactin break. ADH, don't pee, save the water. Oxytocin, remove the milk. This whole push the milk, right? So that's it. That's the whole end of this whole chapter.